Hey guys, so I was just checking my daily dose of Jimmy Dore and this video popped up, so I'm just gonna quickly watch and react and see what's new.
Guess what, ladies and gentlemen? According to Ukrainska Pravda, sources close.
Okay. Let me hear that again. I'm sorry.
Gentlemen, according to Ukrainska Pravda, sources, ladies and gentlemen, according to Ukrainska Pravda,
Ukrainska Pravda? You crank it? Is that what it is? You crank it and then it's not a hard word. Ukrainska. So I already love how this is, where this is going. This is a tweet, but by a random person, and it says, according, I guess to, it's kind of missing the to. According Ukrainska Pravda, sources close to Zelensky, Boris Johnson, who appeared in the capital almost without warning, brought a simple message that even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreement guarantees with Putin, the West are not. Okay, so as usual, let's take a look at this article. Should be able to find this quickly. Oh, there we go. This is the article. Let's see if this article is also available in Ukrainian. Yes, it is. It says a little bit. No, it's actually a good translation. Never mind. I love how Boris here is trying to copy Zelensky's. Tough guy walk here. The Russian side was actually ready for the Zelensky. Okay, so this is actually. Wait, so. Okay, so they're quoting their own article from some time ago. First was revelation of the atrocities. The second obstacle to agreements arrived in Kiev. Okay. Details. According to Ukrainska Pravda sources close to Zelensky, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, brought two simple messages. First is Putin is a war criminal. Second is if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements, they're not. I mean, how would they even figure and all of that? Wouldn't the agreements be between Russia and Ukraine? Johnson's position was that the collective West, which back in February had suggested Zelensky should surrender and flee, yes, that's true, now felt that Putin was not really as powerful as they have previously imagined, and that here was a chance to press him. And Putin went public and said talks with Ukraine had turned into a dead end. And then Abramovich arrived. And then the process was paused. Okay, so this kind of this implies that it was Johnson who was the messenger for the West, who basically went to Kiev and said, yeah, we're not going to support you with any negotiations. I do remember the US talking about not being more Ukrainian than Ukraine. I think this was after this particular incident. And Boris Johnson was in particular far more hawkish than anybody else. But anyway, I digress. Let's go back and see what good old Jimmy has to say about this.
sources close to Zelensky, Boris Johnson.
First of all, this could be total bullshit because the sources are anonymous. It's a quote unquote leak and so on. So take this with a grain of salt.
Who appeared in the Capitol almost without warning, brought a simple message that even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin, the West are not. So,
dun dun dun.
We talked about this before, that the impediment to peace in Ukraine is not Vladimir Putin. It's Joe Biden and NATO.
Wait, so I don't understand how this works. If they told him, hey, don't sign the agreements, we're not going to support you, and he signs the agreements, so what happens then? Is he going to lose their military support that he doesn't already, like, at that point he wouldn't need it, right? I would understand if it was the other way around. If the West would be forcing him to sign it, and then they would say, okay, if you don't sign, then we're not going to support you militarily. But that doesn't make sense either. I don't think this makes sense. Wait, let me think about it. Okay, so they told him that he shouldn't sign the agreements because he shouldn't sign the peace deal because what? Because they're not gonna support him anymore. But then he can sign anyway, and nothing bad will happen. Maybe it was some economic pressure or something. I don't get this.
And they're not allowed. And who's part of that? This guy. And they're not allowing this guy to do any peace negotiations. That's what's happening. So I'm going to read you this article.
I guess the logic doesn't go more than like Zelensky's a puppet or something.
Of it anyway. Possibility of talks between Zelensky and Putin came to a halt after Johnson's visit. So again, you're not going to hear this on CNN. You're not going to hear this on MSNBC. The New York Times aren't going to tell you this, and if they do, they'll tell you in a propagandized way. So
I'm pretty sure Ukrainska Pravda is pretty propagandy, no? Let's see what's on their homepage. Refusal of gas from Russia cost the EU less than first year of COVID. Okay, so pro-Ukraine. From Zelensky's surrender to Putin's surrender, how the negotiations with Russia are going. Okay, that sounds like an interesting article. And it's the same guy. He seems to be a specialist. Romanyuk. He seems to be a specialist on negotiations. If Hungary still wants to join NATO, we will not veto. Hungary to not block Ukraine's EU membership. In the east, Ukrainian armed forces repelled 12 attacks, destroyed the helicopter and equipment of the invaders. Russian killed 3 civilians. Okay, so this is definitely not a Jimmy Dore affiliated website. It's look at this. I'm sorry, I forgot. They have the numbers as like a banner on their site. And these are, by the way, these are the Ukrainian numbers. Yeah, these are way more than I think we can confirm. Journalists fight, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, there's definitely not alternative media. That would be, I think Jimmy is misinterpreting this a little bit. He's saying, hey, nobody will tell you this, but it's pretty much Ukrainian media that's talking about this.
To this newspaper, sources close to Zelensky, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, who appeared in a Capitol almost without warning, brought 2 simple messages. What were the...
he appeared without warning because he didn't want to get killed by announcing his visit, right? So that's how you do it.
Messages. Number one, first, that Putin is a war criminal and he should be pressured, not negotiated with.
Yeah, this was after Bucha, I think.
Don't negotiate. Now, we all know how this war is going to end. It's going to end however Russia and Putin want it to end.
Oh, really? And why would that be? Is that because Russia is winning in any way, or I mean, why would he say that? Does he not watch what's happening on the ground, or I mean, all politics aside, I'm trying to not be biased here, but it's a super stretch to say that Russia's in any way winning the war. You might say they are controlling, they have the tempo, they are controlling what's happening right now. And they can also stop the war, of course. If they stop fighting, it's going to stop. If they retreat. But other than that, it's not as if this is under their control. Maybe he means, yeah, I'm not sure. It's going to stop if Russia wants it to stop. Russia can also just lose. I mean, Russia can, it's a possibility. You may not, if you're pro Russia, I guess you may not like that, but I think most honest people would admit that that's definitely a possibility. That losing, of course, would be not achieving any of the objectives and losing all of the Ukrainian territory. That's totally possible. I mean, Russia is now fighting against NATO in all but one way, which would be it's the Ukrainians fighting and dying instead of NATO soldiers. In all other ways, it's slowly becoming a war of NATO against Russia. And Russia can't win that war. Nuclear weapons or no nuclear weapons, it's not doable. So I don't understand how Jimmy Dore is so convinced that it's all in Russia's hands. It really isn't.
And the way this war is going to end is with a independent, neutral Ukraine.
That's possible. Okay, sure. Yeah, that's possible. One could argue that was maybe a smarter thing to do before the war, but nobody understands what's in Putin's mind, and nobody understands what would have happened if Ukraine was explicitly neutral. We just don't know. It's quite possible it could have helped. It's quite possible that it could have prevented the war. Doesn't look like it, but it looks like this was something that was kind of pre-planned since way before 2014. There seemed to be preparations on the ground for something like this, but
unless Russia just takes it over.
How can Russia take over Ukraine? How is the tell me how this can happen. Okay, I understand. People so before the war started, and I mean before the most recent war started, not 2014. We had the missiles hitting Ukrainian cities, Kiev, flying over my home. At that point, we had very little information about the so-called special operation, and I wouldn't blame Jimmy for saying something like this back then. I was kind of expecting Ukraine to resist, but not perform as well as they have performed. And initially, Russia was pretty cold. They used their precision missiles. They hit a lot of targets in Ukraine. They destroyed a lot of the air force. I think many people have thought that it's going to be just a quick war, including Russia, apparently. And if they have grabbed the Hostomel airport, and if many of the things that have happened the way they happened, if they happened differently, it could have been a different situation. Now, after quitting on Kiev, which is pretty much not an option anymore, Russia's not able to mount an offensive there without incredible losses. It's just not doable. I don't see how they can take over Ukraine. This tells me that he's just maybe very misinformed. Somebody who's informed would maybe make a better point. They would say, yeah, Russia is controlling the way the war works. They can stop the war at any point if they want to. If they don't want to, the war will take a long time, which is plausible. But saying that it's like they can, if they want, maybe they'll just take over Ukraine. It's not realistic. What's very likely, it's going to be a very protracted conflict if Ukraine doesn't get to kick them. Oh, hey, Mr. 93 00. Jimmy Dore is right. Russia is right. Okay. I'm not talking about right and wrong here. I'm not making normative statements. I'm making descriptive statements. I'm trying to describe what's happening. We can talk about being right, of course. So yeah, I don't think it's possible that Russia will be able to take over Ukraine. I think most people would agree with me on that, including pro-Russian people, including people like Strelkov and many others.
But it's going to end however Russia wants, and the best we can get is in neutral Ukraine, meaning they're not going to join NATO, and the people in the Donbass who...
NATO is off the table for Ukraine pretty much even now. So, okay, Hungary just recently said they're not going to block the joining NATO. I don't think that's going to happen easily. It may happen after the war, I don't know, but NATO was definitely not super enthusiastic about Ukraine joining. Ukraine did want to join, kind of. Well, you can say that the Ukrainian government really wanted to join since the revolution, but yeah.
Who didn't go along with the 2014 coup institute.
It is not Russia's goal to make Ukraine a part of Russia. Sure, yeah, I agree. I don't think Russia wanted to make Ukraine a part of Russia. That would be too difficult. They just need there just needs to a government that isn't armed by the U.S. instigated to fight Russia, counter-terrorize eastern Ukraine. Yeah, so this is the argument that Russia has intervened because they couldn't stand. You would say they couldn't stand to watch people dying in Donbass, right? Being killed by Ukraine. I guess that was the. So yeah, Putin has said things like this multiple times, and he has basically said that Russia has waited long enough, and we don't want to wait anymore. And Russia waited for 8 years. Well, yeah, sure. By the U.S. Puppet regime, terrorist regime. Okay. What do you mean by? I understand the U.S. puppet regime thing. I think Jimmy Dore talked about this before. I think what people mean when they say this is Yanukovych was a legitimate president, and then he was removed by force by, I guess, CIA, etc. And then Poroshenko was put in his place, and since that point, Russia became a puppet state, I guess. I just don't understand the U.S. You're saying the U.S. puppet regime terrorized the region. How did, and also can you explain? I saw comments on my YouTube channel just recently. Maybe you can explain too. How they said Ukraine's attacked Russia. So I'm not sure about that. I didn't understand that at all. How did Ukraine terrorize the region? Unless you're talking, are you talking about the Donbas region? I guess you're talking about Donbas. In which case, by this you mean the shelling of and people dying there. Yeah, that's totally true. People have died in Donbas. They've died on both sides, but civilians, I think, have died more in the separatist-controlled regions. So if we go to, let's go to Ukrainian-Russian war. Russo-Ukrainian war. Okay, that's the official name right now. So hopefully it's going to be phases here. Okay, so frozen conflict. Can we find the casualties? Okay, casualties and losses. Okay, so I think this is the number. Or wait, I'm gonna just Google this real quick. Just want to find this, the number. Donbas. Donbas casualties. Okay, war in Donbas before. Okay, so there's a separate article here. And Wikipedia says before the invasion. Okay, this is what I'm looking for. So total is 14,000 people. Out of those, I guess, out of those, 3,400 have been killed who were civilians. And this is the United Nations estimate. And then, okay, and these are the other estimates. There's an estimate of 500, 400 to 500 Russian armed forces being killed. Those were helping the DNR, LNR. Okay, so that's a lot of people. And this has been happening over a long period of time. So this is used basically as the argument for the invasion. For the Ukrainian government, yeah, the argument is going back to Russia waited for 8 years. Russia's position was that Ukraine was not fulfilling the Minsk agreements, which would, I think, do a referendum, give them autonomy, and Ukraine was kind of dragging their feet, yeah, while there was this trench warfare all the time with shellings on both sides where people were dying. For the Ukrainian government, especially since it was stalled by the US, okay, well, that's debatable. Let's talk about joining NATO as an aggression towards Russia. Okay. NATO is not a legitimate organization. Russia is acting defensively to resist US military encirclement. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense from that perspective. NATO is not capable. The sad truth is, or maybe the happy truth is, that NATO is not really capable of attacking Russia. The US themselves can attack Russia with nuclear weapons. They can do a preemptive strike. They would have to immediately fight China as well, obviously, because China is close to Russia. But any kind of, they don't need Ukraine for that. Let me tell you my version of of this theory, okay, that makes sense for me just militarily, right? I think Ukraine is useful for NATO as a place for trapping Russia, right? If Russia is busy in Ukraine, if Russia is busy waging war in Ukraine, and then you strike Russia with nuclear weapons, Russia is screwed, right? Russia wouldn't have any way to defend themselves from attack from NATO right now. What is very much slowing Russia right now is the fact that they have to be ready to defend from NATO. They still have to have for example, the Kaliber cruise missiles. They have to keep a lot of them just to be able to defend themselves. So if Russia loses this war in Ukraine, Russia stops being a major player. Russia's moves down on the list of threats to the US, because when we say NATO, we mean different things. If we talk about Europe, sure, we're talking about European countries. But if we're talking about NATO as a military force, we're kind of talking about the US, right? It's pretty much the same thing, especially if you're talking about the Air Force and, of course, the nuclear power of the bloc. So then this would be a great way to weaken Russia. This would be a best way to weaken Russia, I think, to have them fight in Ukraine for as long as possible. And so that's possibly where, Johnson was coming from here, because, doing peace talks would just stop the war. Russia would be able to rebuild, reinforce, but having a dragged out conflict, yes, I agree. Russia, yes, I think we agree on that. The US wants the war to be long, Russia wants it to be short. Yeah, that's totally true. Russia wanted to do this in like 5 days if possible, and have a nice parade in Kiev, go back home, and nobody dies, ideally. That was the whole plan. I think a lot of misinformation led Russia to believe that there would be much, much less resistance, and then this happened. So you could argue, I mean, if you like conspiracy theories, you could say that maybe there was, it's sometimes almost as if Russia's military command is doing the worst possible thing, right? Attacking Ukraine from like, I don't know, 8 different directions with separate commanders, having a very narrow line of attack that was hopeless from the beginning. It tells me that either there was misinformation or just pure incompetence, corruption. Of course, that's possible too, and that's always possible as an addition. But they're not doing a good job in terms of protecting Russia's strategic interests, right? I think a far wiser approach to this whole thing, assuming that you have all the argumentation, would have been to just limit yourself to Donbass. And sure, okay, you can shoot missiles, you can destroy Ukraine's infrastructure, you can destroy the Air Force, which, I mean, pretty much they achieved that. The Ukrainian Air Force is next to non-existent. It's gonna, I guess, be rebuilt now that they have unlimited money. The anti-air systems almost didn't work in the first days, so that was the moment to maybe take Donbass. Okay, save reinforce those borders and just freeze there and just stop there. Even we say that Russia could have done a better job tactically. Russia's strategic situation is still better. The US can hurt Russia by committing the war longer, but the US-backed Ukrainians can't really win. Well, it depends what you mean by winning. It's definitely beneficial for NATO that this is ideal for NATO in terms of they're supplying the weapons, the Ukrainians are dying, and Russia is, Russians and Ukrainians are dying, right? And NATO soldiers are not dying. They're doing a lot of weapon sales and a lot of money is going around. Even if in the beginning I would say that, okay, this is not a lot of, it's not a lot of support compared to the U.S. military defense budget right now. It's real money. It's a lot of money. So yeah, I think NATO is pretty happy about what's happening right now, and they would very likely want this to continue as long as possible. I don't think Ukraine in this situation has a lot of choice, especially if we talk about Zelensky. I don't think Zelensky can now go and negotiate. I think Zelensky is in a corner, just like Putin is. Honestly, because Putin really can't go back either, right? Zelensky can't go back either. He would be immediately overthrown by more uh, the right and the far right. So he can't really surrender Ukrainian territory and stuff like that. He's committed to the end. And I think so is Putin at this point, unfortunately. I think that's the worst thing at this point, is that nobody really wants to negotiate. I don't think Russia would negotiate if Ukraine would offer it. I don't think Russia would negotiate unless it would benefit, tactically to reinforce things. Another thing is that the US is really starting to lose its grip internally. The war is only supported by the liberal intelligentsia. That's not true. No, that's not true. The war is not supported by. It depends what you mean by the war. If you mean support for intervening, yeah, of course. I don't think people want the U.S. to fight wars in Ukraine or to die for Ukraine, but I think support for Ukraine is pretty good. Let me do a quick Google on that. So let's just do support for Ukraine. And let's say support for Ukraine, United States poll results. Okay, so this is Utah. Big majority of Americans support. Okay, this is Voice of America. Strong bipartisan support to supplemental funding. Framing the question, is the U.S. doing enough to help? Presupposes Ukraine is right. Yeah, I don't see the actual questions. You're right that the questions can be leading, sure. Let's take a look at the poll itself, hopefully. But I think this poll is just about, the refugees, so that's not strong. Administration. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. Reuters Ipsos, 73%. 3 in 4 Americans back arms shipments to Ukraine. Okay, so let's try and find the questions. Today poll, previous Reuters poll, latest poll. Growing tensions. About half of you worry that Russia could try and influence the elections. Okay. 70% of Democrats, 24% of Republicans approve of Biden's performance in Ukraine. Yeah. Approval on economy. Yeah, I'm not seeing any useful questions here. I guess the question was, do you support the U.S. efforts to supply Ukraine with weapons? That would be my guess based on this. So it seems that there's a lot of support for giving Ukraine weapons. I think this would drop significantly if you would go to U.S. pilots, boots on the ground, of course. And you have to remember that there isn't really a difference. I mean, with all respect to Jimmy, he's an exception, right? The mainstream media won't really. The mainstream media won't talk about this like I do, right? Even like as I do, right? And I'm definitely not affiliated here, right? But I'm not propagandizing. I think if you watch CNN, if you watch the mainstream media, you'll just see an endless stream of ex-NATO generals who talk about how Ukraine needs much more weapons and needs them now and needs them super soon, and then they're all working for the defense contractors. So that's what you see if you watch the TV, and yeah, I mean that's obviously what you're gonna get. Many people are not interested in where their government is trying to drag them. Yeah, I mean, most Americans, I think, don't really, with respect to Ukraine, I think most Americans don't really care about this issue a lot. They're more worried about the inflation. They're more worried about, putting food on the table and things like that. Gas prices, I think that would be the top, and probably the reason why the Democrats will lose. I don't think Ukraine will have anything to do with it, although you could argue that Biden didn't handle it really well, but I don't think it's going to matter. Let's go back to Jimmy.
Instituted by the United States and Ukraine. We overthrew their government and installed a puppet regime in 2014. So there's people in eastern Ukraine that didn't want to go along with that. Ukraine government started killing them.
Hmm. Let me hear that again.
Eastern Ukraine regime instituted by the United States and Ukraine. We overthrew their government and installed a puppet regime in 2014.
The US overthrew them. I think this is one of those things that have started by themselves. They were definitely influenced by, I mean, the governments in general. They want to control what's happening. We remember the recordings from the Americans and the fighting they had with the EU when the whole thing was, when Maidan was happening. Of course, they were trying to influence this. I think there was financing as well. I remember seeing evidence of that as well from the US in particular. So if by this he means we overthrew the government, I don't think that was enough to overthrow the government. So I think you needed people to believe that Yanukovych was saying no to the West, which I remember. I remember that being the case back then. I think many people were misguided, unfortunately, by the fact that they thought the EU association as EU membership. It was really as stupid as that. There were interviews on the street. People were being asked, hey, what do you think about this whole thing? And people were saying, well, of course, because he said no to joining Europe, and you have like Pacific Islands who have the same association levels. So people were misinformed. Now you could argue that those people were, useful idiots for others, I guess. There was definitely a lot of there was a ton of Ukrainian politicians who were trying to use the whole thing as a way to get to power, and that was the struggle that I think the Americans were talking about. But I think saying that the US did this single-handedly is a stretch. It helped, but it definitely did not maybe even initiate it, because it was very random the way it happened, the way Yanukovych reacted, the way there's a conspiracy theory I think about the shooting or the beating that provoked then the large protests and then the shootings. And I think there is still a lack of clarity about who was shooting on whom, when, and so on. But it's not as simple as saying it's not it's not as if the US can just, snap their fingers and say, okay, it's going to be a different government right now. Ukraine is very chaotic. It was chaotic back then, it's chaotic right now. You can't really control it easily. And what happens is it's pretty much random. You can try to ride the wave, which maybe the US tried to do, but
So there's people in eastern Ukraine that didn't want to go along with that. Ukraine government started killing them.
I mean, not really. That's not really what happened. What happened is um, people in the East didn't support removing Yanukovych because those people have voted for Yanukovych, and Yanukovych has. No, I have not stepped on a landmine today. Interesting fact. I used to work in Bosnia. I used to work for a demining agency, so I guess I have some useful skills about that. Of course, I didn't actually do the mines. I was doing the IT stuff and the mapping, but yeah. So the people in the East basically were the ones who voted for Yanukovych democratically. So of course they were upset. You elected somebody, and then somebody, over in Kiev has decided to overthrow them, and yeah, they were upset. So then he's saying Ukraine started killing them. I mean, a separatist movement started in those regions, and Russia helped a lot. I think in more direct ways than the U.S. in Kiev. And then people started dying. Yeah,
And they're Russian speakers.
sure. But again, I think the talking point about Russian speakers is a little bit overblown. I was talking about Azov recently, day before yesterday. I think I had a stream about Azov. They speak Russian. Russian is like their official language. They just don't like to talk about it. So much about the suppression of Russian language. I don't think that's a big deal, but sure, there were people who were. I remember a lady driving to a McDonald's, I think in Odessa, insisting that they respond to her in Ukrainian, calling the police. And I mean, you're always going to get assholes like that, I guess.
So that's how it's going to end. They're going to have autonomy for that Eastern Ukraine Russian speakers, and Ukraine's going to be neutral, meaning they're not going to join NATO.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine used to be neutral, I think, until Mr. Poroshenko added NATO as a strategic direction for Ukraine because he's an idiot and because he's tried to win political points based on that. That was incredibly stupid. That was just, yeah.
That's how it's going to end. Go ahead.
It's amazing that Ukraine, the Ukrainian officials have bought into this Western narrative, because obviously now Russia has invested so much time, energy, and resources into the war that they might still go to the negotiating table. I think it would appease, China and India, who they want to be in the, they want to keep them happy. But at the end of the day, they're less likely to negotiate with Ukraine now after already, launching this war for several months.
Russia's not going to negotiate because of China. I mean, that's an ignorant thing to say. Russia is starting to depend more on China because of the whole sanctions thing, but I don't think China has any leverage over what Russia does. I don't think China wanted the war to happen at all. China is trying to do its own thing with Taiwan, of course, but that's a separate story. But I don't think they like the war. I don't think they don't like the war. They also kind of enjoy the fact that Russia is getting weaker because China likes a weak Russia, of course, because who doesn't?
And Ukraine has lost a significant amount of territory, and they've established a land bridge from Crimea to Donbass, and they're starting to circulate rubles there. So they're literally.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and there are also some. I saw some official-looking papers with Russian stamps and things. So it does seem like the long game is to make it maybe a province or something, to annex it.
Literally putting up Russian flags at these administrative buildings, replacing the Ukrainian currencies. They've lost it, and they didn't have to. That's
They didn't
that's
have
the
to.
insane part of this all.
So, but the reason why I think Zelensky and the Ukrainian leaders.
But yeah, just because that's happening doesn't mean those territories will actually stay occupied. It's extremely hard to hold them. If I were a betting person, I would say, yeah, it's not gonna hold the same way for sure. Again, because of the incredible amount of weapons that's coming into Ukraine.
Are going along is because they've been threatened with death and that the Nazis will kill them if they actually negotiate, and they'll lose and they won't have any backing if they negotiate from UK, Boris Johnson, or NATO, or from Joe Biden. So so Zelensky is a complete puppet and being used, and the Ukrainian people are being used as cannon fodder by Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, and NATO, correct?
So these three things are very different. Boris Johnson, NATO, and Biden, right? I think Biden is terrified of Putin, what Putin's going to do. He was afraid to sanction Putin's mistress. He's afraid of, he's an old school person. He's terrified of nuclear weapons, of the Cold War, and all of that stuff. Boris Johnson is super hawkish. NATO is, who the hell knows? But I would guess with the US. I mean, NATO is not unified in the way they look at the war. If you look at the Eastern Bloc, they're very hawkish. Some other countries, very different, like Hungary, right? So it's hard to say who speaks for NATO. I don't think anybody does. I think NATO is this loose alliance of countries that that are basically trying to ensure themselves from being attacked by Russia. And it seems to work because Russia so far has not attacked a NATO country. So by that just straightforward dumb logic, it kind of makes sense. If Ukraine was part of NATO, Ukraine probably wouldn't be invaded. So it kind of makes sense. I think I don't think NATO in particular, if you're talking about the US and other countries, they have strictly speaking, a unified view on things. Even though Biden is talking about that all the time, I don't think that's actually true.
Correct. Yeah. I think Colonel Douglas McGregor, who is Trump's Pentagon senior advisor, he said, there's a lot of people in the Pentagon he keeps in close contact with, and they don't really know who's in control of Zelensky right now. Is it the Nazis? Is it these deep state officials in the U.S.? But it doesn't matter at the end of the day. They all want the same thing insofar as continuing this war and dragging it out for as long as possible.
So the first thing that Boris Johnson said is that Putin is not to be negotiated with. What? So they don't want to end this war. Who's they? The West, Biden, NATO.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. The U.S. had NGOs in Ukraine, so M9300. The U.S. had NGOs in Ukraine, ton of money going into them. They deliberately cultivated dissent. Yeah, the U.S. does this in most countries in the world. Yeah. If any other country did this to the US would have a fit. We had Russia today, right? We had RT, and they were banned only recently after the whole war started. I would definitely say that RT was doing the same thing. And it was very effective, I think. I'm pretty sure Jimmy would have maybe 99% of the same views. I don't think this would be any different on RT. So, yeah. I don't think the U.S. has as good a media presence in Russia and Ukraine as RT as Russia had in with RT. RT was super effective, I think, especially in Europe, in terms of influencing the popular opinion. In Ukraine, you have this crazy media situation of oligarchs, each one controlling their own channels, blah blah blah. It was relatively hard to, but yeah, NGOs, sure. Russia did far less to the US in 2016. You're referring to the elections. Even if it were just this, it is an example of the US imperialist aims at Russia. I mean, the United States would like to be the strongest country in the world, and they would like to dominate the world. I think any country on the top would have the same goals. So I guess you can say that, but I don't think if you're referring to a theory that the US would want to invade Russia or take Russia's territory or something like that, I don't think that's true. NATO's reasons for existence, forcing the US-led, Wall Street-led economic order on the world. It has nothing to do with defense. Okay, well, hard disagree on that. I think it's pretty obvious that NATO is not a very effective tool for creating a single agenda on anything. I think it's a purely militaristic, utilitarian kind of organization. The reason, again, let's be practical. Why do you have NATO? Because you have the United States, you have the air dominance. Most countries don't have that at all. If you're part of NATO, then you will have that immense air support. You will have countries that have nukes, all of that as a guarantee against being attacked by somebody like Russia. And you do that in exchange for what? For changing your country's standards a little bit, training with the best militaries in the world. There's really no downside, except NATO is kind of trying to force you to spend more on defense. We know that before Trump came to office, many countries were spending much less on their defense than was actually required. Because why would they? The NATO was protecting them, so they could focus on other things, like Germany, right? Germany just gave bases to NATO. Sure, you can use them. We'll do other stuff like saving refugees and stuff like that. The most powerful governments that make up NATO are governments that are only in power because when World War II ended, there was enough US troops in those countries. I'm not sure I understand that. The most powerful governments that make up NATO are governments that are only in power because when World War II ended, there was enough US troops in those countries. They're in power because there was enough US troops. Can you clarify that? What do you mean by that? France would have been communist after. Oh, okay. That's what you mean. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree. France would have been a different country. Yeah. But again, was that really controlled by the US? I guess in some way, but you could say the same thing about the Soviet Union, though, right? Many countries would have been very different if the Russian soldiers weren't there, right? Well, not Russian, Soviet soldiers.
And the second thing is that even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin, they are not. No negotiations. Keep the war going. Johnson's position was that the collective West, which back in February had suggested Zelensky should surrender and flee,
this is true, actually, yeah,
are now felt that Putin was not really as powerful as they had previously imagined, and that here was a chance to press him. They want to escalate the war. 3 days after Johnson left for Britain,
I wouldn't say maybe escalate. I would say just prolong, right?
Putin went back and said talks with Ukraine had turned into a dead end. This is from the West. Again, we're the maniac terrorists. Again, we're the warmongers. Again, we're the imperialists. Again, we're the hegemonic maniacs. Again, it's the West. The myriad of contradictory victory conditions circulating in the West will easily lead to a repetition of fatal historic errors, misunderstanding partial mobilization as general mobilization, turning an unofficial proxy war, aka special operation, officially into World War III.
What? This is a word salad, isn't it? The myriad of contradictory victory conditions circulating in the West easily lead to a repetition of fatal historical errors, misunderstanding partial mobilization as general mobilization, turning an official proxy war, aka special operation, officially into World War III. What? I don't understand. I understand the part about the different victory conditions that different people have, but I don't understand the rest of this. Partial mobilization, general mobilization. US media needs people like Dore. I think the U.S. media would be healthier if we would have people like this in a debate with people who challenge them. Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think it's ever good when you have just a single opinion, because people like to think in simple terms, and when you give them people don't have the time, right? They have to go to work, they have to cook, they have to feed the kids. And when you have this fast food on TV that's, prepared for you, you just eat it. So even though I don't agree with Jimmy and most things, I would definitely say that yes, we need more different voices, but not preaching to the choir like this. I would love to talk to Jimmy. I would love to talk to people who have these opinions. Maybe not in a formal debate, but in a back and forth where I could learn more about how they see the world and what they think, because it's important, because it's a lot of people that think like this. Triple X Sex Shaver, hi, go ahead, sure.
I've noticed that none of the military geopolitics pundits in the U.S. who are called on by the major mainstream media have never suggested any actions early on to set up negotiations to defuse the situation and prevent it from building up to war. It's like everybody on the Sunday shows wanted a war because they all work for the people who profit off of wars. They're all working for arms manufacturers or oil companies.
Well, this is kind of true, actually. Yeah, I guess it's just the nature of the business, right? When you work as a general and then you I guess retire or go out and you basically do nothing somewhere, right? On a board, and you get paid for that. And you go to CNN, you go to MSNBC, and you talk about this. I mean, of course, they will talk about things they talk about.
All of them. Interesting that the story was leaked to the UP by people in Zelensky's circle. The usually lively
Allegedly.
Ukrainian press has been very patriotic and on message since Russia's invasion. So that was leaked by people close to Zelensky. Why would they leak that? Because they see what's happening. They want peace in their country. People
No, no. Okay, this is a total misunderstanding of. So let's assume this was leaked, right? That this is even true because we don't know because it's anonymous. But let's assume that this was leaked by the Ukrainians to Ukrainska Pravda. This would have been leaked as a way to show support. So the whole message before it's not like Zelensky wanted to negotiate and Johnson came in and said, don't negotiate. No, this was the party line pretty much in Ukraine. We're not going to negotiate with, especially after the alleged war crimes, right? They weren't going to negotiate, and then and then somebody leaks that this is to support the Ukrainian narrative. Again, we went to their website. This is what they have on the front page. Okay, so this is a super pro-Ukrainian, mass media. It's not a. Yeah, Jimmy doesn't understand this for sure.
In Zelensky's own circle want peace in their country, and they want people to know that it's the West who are making it impossible.
No, again, it's the total opposite of. He doesn't understand the propaganda from in Ukraine.
Anything you like? Go ahead.
Could also be potentially, it may have been leaked because Boris Johnson caught a lot of heat from Ukrainian officials and other Western officials. He's the only Western official who's come out and said that it's highly likely that Russia could win this war. And he got a lot of flack for that. So maybe they were trying to, go after him for coming out and saying something as irrational as that. Who knows?
Well, but you don't think that changes the fact that NATO and the West are the ones who are standing in the way of a peace deal, right?
No, yeah, they obviously are. They're the ones who started this war. But what I'm saying is I think that he probably definitely did do that.
They didn't start the war. I think that's I think that's, even if you're super understanding, I don't think you can argue that against the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine and that was the war, and Russia started that war.
I think that's a given. I mean, the U.S. has come out and said they don't want a peace deal either. But the fact that they specifically chose to leak this about Boris Johnson may have been in an effort to discredit him and kind of light him up a little bit.
To two birds with one stone.
Yeah.
This is not discrediting at all. This would make him look cool to the Ukrainian people.
Yeah. We're doing live stand-up shows.
Okay, Jimmy. Yeah, I guess I'm gonna finish here. Thank you very much for chatting. I love to hear about your opinions, especially because they're very different from mine. I'm always fascinated by people arriving to different conclusions, starting from the same set of facts. So I'm very interested to learn more and to understand more about the way you see the world. M9300, which sides attack first isn't what determines who is right. Yes, but let's be clear. I'm talking, he said United States started the war, or let's say Ukraine started the war. I'm talking only about that. I'm not making any moral judgments, right? We can talk about that part, what should be right, what is wrong. I'm just talking about the fact that Russia has invaded a separate country that they have recognized before that. They have signed the agreement to recognize those borders. You could argue that things have provoked that they have reasons for that. That's going into the moral thing, but to dispute that Russia has started the war is disputing with the facts, I think. What if in 1930 Poland invaded Germany instead of the reverse? That really happened. Germany would still be in the wrong side even if Poland... Germany wouldn't be in the wrong if Germany would defend its territory, of course. But instead Germany invaded Poland using a false flag operation, which sounds familiar, right? So it's really as simple as that. You just don't get to, in the 21st century, you don't get to attack, you don't get to invade countries for the intent of annexing them, clearly, right? Just openly like this. You can do it like the US does it, right? If you're the US, you can invade Afghanistan, you can invade Iraq, you can put your own people there, you can try to build nations and build democracies and stuff like that. You can do that. That's really terrible if we're going to talk about the morality of it, right? But the US did not attempt to annex Afghanistan or Iraq, right? Nazi Germany would still be wrong even if they didn't get a chance to invade anyone. Wrong about what? About their ideology, or I guess you're talking about the ideology. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just the military part of it, what has been done. I'm not talking about the motives. If the World War II started by Germany getting invaded, okay. It would not make Germany the right side. I fail to understand the analogy because, again, if Germany would defend itself in that situation, they would be in the right. But if they went out and invaded Poland, I don't think they would be in the right in terms of just, international norms. Just that. I'm not talking about the, Nazis and fascism and all of that. But you can have countries kill their own people, and that happens all the time. Look at North Korea, for example, right? You have pretty bad things happening there. And they happen to have a lot of artillery pointed at South Korea, and nobody's messing with them, right? So I don't think it necessarily tells you a lot in terms of the, used to be. I mean, de facto, it's not anymore, right? After the Korean War, Korea is de facto, it's kind of split, right? Half of the country is occupied by the US. No, it's not. It's supported by the US. It's propped up by the US, but it's its own thing. It's a really unique country. And you'd be surprised. Maybe you want to look into a little bit more about South Korea. It's a very fascinating country. I think they both call themselves, like, internally, they call themselves Korea. So, so maybe you're right about that. But yeah. But yeah, South Korea is. Let's ignore the history and let's look at what we have now. South Korea is definitely its own thing right now. Anyway, guys, thank you very much for watching. I'm going to wrap it up here and probably be back tomorrow around the same time to continue talking about these things because it's interesting. And I'll be working on some YouTube videos as well that are a little bit more highly produced so that there's a little bit more structure because there is none in these streams. I'm just taking the conversation wherever it takes me. I'm hoping for people to join me as well. Hopefully, most people I want to talk to are busy at the time, so I'll have to be patient a little bit and be on my own. But yeah, watch me on YouTube too, and make sure to subscribe. Leave comments there, of course, and have fun. Talk to you soon.